Hello and welcome. I'm Stuart Craner, co-founder of Thinkers 50, the world's leading platform for management ideas. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event from the Business Ecosystem Alliance. The Alliance is a partnership between Thinkers 50 and the Higher Research Institute. Our members include some of the world's leading thinkers on business ecosystems and organizations in the vanguard of making ecosystems a reality. The founding belief of the Business Ecosystem Alliance is that ecosystems are an important and growing reality in the life of organizations of all types, in all locations, and in all sectors of activity. We are dedicated to the furtherance of knowledge and understanding and working towards a better world through ecosystems. We have some fantastic sessions lined up, and some great pre-recorded content is already available on our website, featuring Linda Hill from Harvard Business School, chief strategy officers from major corporations, a revealing case study of ecosystems at work with Hire in Thailand, as well as insights and wisdom from Partha Ghosh, Kyan Krippendorf, Paul Sangeet Chowdhury, Anika Stryber, Amit Kapoor, and a host of others. Our upcoming live sessions will feature Mark Grieven from IMD, Michael Jacobides from London Business School, Alessandro Di Fiore of ECSI Consulting, the always excellent Christian Sarkar, Caroline Frankenberger from the University of St. Gallen, and Simone Cicero. The full program is available at our website. I'm especially delighted that this session features one of the true pioneers in the field of business ecosystems, James Moore. James's 1993 article, Predators and Prey, A New Ecology of Competition, and his best-selling book, The Death of Competition, Leadership and Strategy in the Age of Business Ecosystems, created a new agenda for business and beyond. He has continued to be a pioneer, taking a unique and compelling path through conventional wisdom. Our format in this session is that James Moore will talk for a while and present his latest thinking. We will then have a discussion about his ideas and insights. So please send in your questions at any time and I will relay them to James. We have live translation into Mandarin available. See the button at the bottom of your screen. And recordings of all sessions will be available to be learned from later. So James Moore is joining us today from Costa Rica. Welcome, James. Very nice to have you here with us.
Thank you very much, Stuart. I'm glad we could, it's wonderful we can do this, and it's amazing.
Well, the stage is yours to begin sharing your ideas, and I encourage anybody watching, and we've got people throughout the world watching, to send in your questions, and I will be in charge of relaying them to James.
Yeah, so welcome. I've dreamed of this moment for many years as I've watched the community of ecosystem researchers expand around the world. Today I tend to be a researcher more than a consultant these days. I've been both, but I get every day new articles published in peer-reviewed journals, which are sent to me by various alert services, and it's just fantastic to see, particularly the global breadth. So here's a shout out to everybody who's watching this, and thanks a lot. And it's wonderful to find a way to be connected, and I'm thankful to Hire for making this possible. I think part of what has happened, and I didn't really anticipate this 30 years ago, is that the ecosystem concept is actually a very open concept. And at root, it's rather simple, right? It's that people have dreams and purposes, and then they gather together to make these futures happen. And the radical thing from a business strategy standpoint was it wasn't a thing focused typically on firms. It was focused on people and their dreams coming together, and firms played a role. There are leading firms, of course, and so forth. But ultimately, it's about people thinking about doing something together and then doing it. And so over the years, we've gone from business ecosystems, which was simply a way to say it wasn't a biological ecosystem, to startup ecosystems and innovation ecosystems, and now workforce ecosystems and regional ecosystems and advanced manufacturing and so forth and so on. And so it's become a very, very general concept, and I think that's just wonderful. It's also a concept that focuses on time and evolution and development. which makes it very happily. It's happily helpful if you are trying to make something happen. It's a theory really not just of something being there and having a certain static, static presence, but actually being a dynamic that you can enter into and relate to and move. And it leads then to a lot of practical ideas. What I've come to see it as is what I call action research at scale. Kurt Lewin, or Lewin, if you want to pronounce it that way, but Kurt Lewin was one of the early founders of organizational theory and systems theory in organizations. And his major observation about action research was that when we're dealing with complex systems, the only real way to do research is to try to do something purposive with that system, try to interrupt it or extend it or shape it. That is how you enter into a relationship with the system, and then it's from that relationship that you begin to understand its dynamics. You understand how it pushes back. You understand how it moves forward, how it changes, and through the expected and unexpected of action research, that's how you learn. And what's been wonderful, how the action research perspective has also led us to a deeper and deeper understanding of systems theory and systems dynamics. And indeed, we're going to get back to talking about higher later on, but one of the fascinating things I've found there is that Mr. Zhang and the people around him and with him have a very, very deep understanding of systems theory and systems analysis right at the frontier. And they actually use that daily to make moves in an action research sense to further the creative human development in their ecosystem. A life coach told me a few years ago to ask the following question. What is invisible to you now, he said, what, Jim, is invisible to you now, that if it became visible, would change everything? And I thought about that, and it's one of these things that you're intended to puzzle over, and I took it home, and he actually encouraged taking walks and thinking about what is invisible to me now that if it became visible would just change everything. And eventually what I realized was that the ongoing sense of being and sense of relationships in my world were largely not things I was directly experiencing. I would be kind of in my head in a conversation. And over time, it became staggeringly obvious. And with a little bit of chagrin, I acknowledged that there's much deeper levels of interaction among people, and that it was very helpful to me to be more and more aware of that. So that's kind of my little personal story. And then this year, during the COVID period, I've had a similar kind of a shift, and the shift has been from seeing ecosystems principally as complex production systems to now seeing them principally as very complex human systems. And I want to tell a little bit of my history here with research to give you a sense of the change. Many years ago, now in the 90s, I became very involved with AT&T and Intel and Hewlett-Packard, three corporations. And I particularly was enamored of how Intel was creating its business ecosystem, or an ecosystem it was creating and managing leading with Microsoft. And what I found fascinating was how it had taken a layered and very kind of blown apart potential personal computer industry that IBM had pulled together into a dominant design. And Intel was able to simultaneously encourage other companies to take piece parts of that IBM dominant design and make those the focus of their specialized work, while at the same time Intel more and more took command of the architecture. And it was not simply the chip architecture for Intel, but it was the Intel architecture kind of writ large, which included the contributions of everybody else. And compared to not having things orchestrated in that way, it was tremendously powerful because it allowed a number of companies to enter into these specialties and advance very, very quickly, much more quickly than they could as part of one hierarchical IBM organization. But at the same time, it allowed people to substitute for each other, to make new combinations, to come up with lots of creative action, and yet all be structured by Intel. And as Intel pursued the Moore's Law trajectory and made faster and faster chips, it developed a thing it called the Intel treadmill. And people were either on or off the Intel treadmill, and it meant they were co-evolving with Intel. But this was kind of a forced march co-evolving. It wasn't really straightforwardly the biological. But again, it was very successful as a business, and I was enamored with it. Now, I did feel the problems with it on the human side. The feeling of being in Intel was actually pretty tough. It was an emotionally difficult place. The people focused heavily on these things called actions required, ARs, often to the exclusion of personal feelings or things like that. And so it was a tough place. And I also found that other companies involved with Intel felt that the ecosystem was a tough place. And trust was actually very, very low. But again, it was very interesting to me, and other people adopted that way of looking at things, and all seemed kind of reasonable. But what had really happened is that Intel had created a kind of a hierarchy across a broader set of specialists. Now, a decade later, I was approached around 2011 by ARM Holdings. And for those of you who don't know the computer and communications industry, ARM Holdings is kind of the modern Intel. It is the architecture that now is under essentially all smartphones. It's the basis of the new Apple M1 chip. It's really become the dominant architecture in the world for microprocessors, other than in the server world, where Intel is still kind of the king. And ARM asked me if I would be interested in studying their ecosystem, and of course I was. And they introduced me not just to their own people, but across the various companies that were involved. And in many regards, it was parallel to Intel. It had a technical architecture, and people were coordinated by that technical architecture in their specialist activities. But I was struck by something immediately that I could feel. It just felt different. If you went up to ARM's headquarters in Silicon Valley, it's Silicon Valley headquarters. It was headquartered in England overall. It had this calm about it. And there were no obvious guards at the front door. There was a person, and you walked in, and there was a kind of a person meeting you, handed you a bottle of water, and you went back in, and it was just a serene place. By contrast, just down the road in Santa Clara, Intel headquarters, you go in, it's heavily guarded like a bank, and uniformed, and just an entirely different feeling. So the ARM thing felt open and different. But as I got into it, it was much more than that. What they had done is they had created an ecosystem that was very open, starting with the system on a chip itself. That the Intel chip was a monolithic one, and when people would innovate in new ways, like in graphics or in communication, Intel would, to the extent possible, integrate it into their chip. But what ARM would do is build a system on a chip. It would build a kind of a framework, and then allow other people to put their content on the chip. And they had this adage, which was, you always want to leave space on the chip. You want to leave room on the chip for everybody else. And in their ecosystem, they left room in the ecosystem for people. They invited people in. Their licensing requirements were very easy. Essentially, no cash up front, very little. And then you paid a percentage way down the line, often several years down the line, when you finally made a product and sold it. And it was just a percentage of your revenues. So they were taking much of the risk of setting you up in using their chip. And then they got this it really varied between 3 and 6% of revenues eventually. And for many years, this business model didn't work very well, except that the ecosystem kept scaling and scaling and scaling and scaling and diversifying and diversifying. And eventually, multiple billions of chips were sitting out there and going into devices that were collecting revenues. And ARM became, with a very few people, a very, very powerful and very, very profitable company. Now, back to me. I wrote about it as a human ecosystem, and I called my book Shared Purpose. But I was still mainly interested in what I just described to you, the technical architecture, the production architecture. And what I did recognize the cooperative mentality, and I recognized that, for example, they had interestingly blended into their ecosystem the open source software movement. And what was fascinating about that is that at the time, the open source software movement was actually highly anti-property rights and in general, anti-commercial use of open source code. It was thought that if you took open source code and made money off of it, you were a, quote, free rider on the voluntary contributions of the members of the community. But ARM, I realized, had somehow struck a balance here. And they could talk about business opportunities along with open source sharing. And they created an ecosystem where people did a tremendous amount of sharing, and they did also did a tremendous amount of business. And they shared business ideas with each other. And one of the keys, by the way, to this is that in general, people as they came in, when they competed with each other or they were in the same specialty, to the extent they could, they would find other niches to go into. So people were intentionally avoiding head-to-head competition and were kind of positioning themselves in relation to different problem sets in the world and different solutions and different customers, such that they were learning a lot from each other because they would be direct competitors in that sense. But at the same time, they were being positioned separately and didn't get into, for example, heavy price wars. And that turned out to be enormously valuable for everyone in the ecosystem in terms of being able to reinvest, in terms of having a stable business and so forth. And the purpose of the ecosystem was to grow more and more of those stable businesses. Now, some point in this study, I met a fellow by the name of Wally Ryan. And Wally is a legendary executive in Silicon Valley. He was one of the early people at Texas Instruments in the early days of chips. He was founder of Mentor Graphics, which is one of the 3 leading chip design companies, chip CAD companies. And now he's leading a new startup with a new form of chip. But Wally told me a really interesting story. He said, do you know how this ARM thing started? And I said, no, not really. And so we went, he said, well, way back in the early 90s, Texas Instruments, we felt like we had been locked out of the chip business by Intel. And we and Intel had jointly started that business. But with the PC revolution, we never found a way to get into that. And so we finally sat down and tried to figure out what we could do. And as we looked seriously at the personal computer ecosystem, what we concluded was that the most important thing there was the community. Now, people would sort of say that. They'd say, yeah, the developers are what makes it, or the customers are what makes it, or the solutions. But he said, no, really, that what we decided was that community of people and its informal connections and in some sense its collective cognition and mind and feelings, it was that community that was actually driving the ecosystem. I mean, they were paying for things, but they also were the ones who did or didn't buy into these visions of where that industry should go. And so I had talked a lot about Andy Grove selling visions that would be compute intensive so that the ecosystem could continue to grow in a more compute intensive way. But Wally's point was that Andy couldn't sell that vision unless this vast community was looking for that, and in some sense drew it out of Intel. So I was really struck by that idea, and I was struck by how the design of the ARM ecosystem, the things that I had seen as open and trust building and ever growing, really from the standpoint of the early designers came from saying, I want to form a community and I want to draw the same kind of people that Intel is drawing, but I want to make it better for people. I want to take people who are now kind of locked into a hierarchy, even if it's an ecosystem hierarchy, and I want to give them an alternative home. And I want them to feel great about this home. And I want their creativity to manifest, and I want it to go more. And guess what? I'm not going to take excess profits out of this. I'm going to make sure there's enough for everybody, including enough for Texas Instruments and enough for ultimately for ARM. So one of the key moves that Texas Instruments did is not to have a Texas Instruments architecture. I won't go through the whole story, but they found in Cambridge, England, the spin out of Cambridge University that had been working on an educational computer called an Acorn, funded by the British Broadcasting Company. And it was almost a nonprofit that had a chip architecture. And it was interestingly jointly owned by Apple and by this company Acorn that made the educational computer, and by VLSA Logic, a small manufacturer of chips in Silicon Valley, sort of a tiny version of DI. And what they did was they set up ARM as a kind of a co-op licensor. They took a license and ended up making an enormously successful product, the Nokia Communicator, the first really GSM digital phone. But Apple also made the Newton, which didn't succeed, but then it eventually made the iPod, which did succeed, and then they eventually made the iPhone that did succeed, all off of that license. As well, it turned out an enormous range of people started making tiny chips that are called embedded chips, that are the chips that go into washing machines and dryers and all sorts of industrial equipment. And that, interestingly, was the beginning of those embedded chips. That was Internet of Things. That was Internet of Things before Internet of Things went wild. And Internet of Things went wild because people began to manufacture ARM chips, this same license, in quantities of billions and billions, and teamed up with the phone companies to create now this 5G ecosystem with IoT and universal connectivity. So that story all is a story of people in a community that is where the organizations are designed to nurture it, not to capture it. Now, I still was enamored by the production function, you could call it, and not the human function. I still hadn't grasped this notion that it could be the human function that drove society and drove progress. And in fact, it has to be, I now believe, the human function that drives progress. So this year in the pandemic, we fortunately came to Costa Rica in January from Boston. And I actually have lung difficulties, and part of the reason we like Costa Rica is that we missed the flu season back in Boston. And so, boy, what a flu season did I miss this year. This became our lifeboat, and it's been a wonderful place to be. I mean, obviously the weather's great and the people are lovely, and it's just a wonderful place. But it's also been really safe. We're up kind of in the mountains near a volcano, and it's a farming area where there were dairy cows mostly. And I got this message by LinkedIn from Mr. G at Hire and from the Hire Model Institute, and they said, we know of your work long ago, and we have been working on ecosystems, and we like people to come over and dialogue with us about it, and we wonder if you would be interested in doing that, in studying our ecosystem and coming over and getting to know us and seeing what we've done. He said honestly, we feel like we've actually read and translated your book on ARM, and we think that's great, but we think we're more advanced than that. What do you think? And of course, the reality here is that both Haier and Mr. Zhang, its CEO, are kind of legendary leaders, and that's a legendary company, subject of many books. The other day, I was arguing with someone about whether it was 5 or 8 books, and then many Harvard and Stanford business school cases and other articles and interviews and so forth. So it's a very well-known, well-loved company. However, I've concluded that it's still not nearly as appreciated as it should be for the research work and the pioneering it's doing in the support of human potential in business by intent, by organization design. Essentially, they're doing action research on human potential in our world. But that's skipping to the conclusion here a little too fast. But I was not able to go to China because of the pandemic, and I have done my research through Zoom. I've partnered with a wonderful friend of mine, Professor Rong Ka at Tsinghua in China, and his wonderful postdocs and doctoral students, led by Mrs. Zheng Hua, and and they've been doing things on the ground. I've also by Zoom been able to zoom into other locations around the world with Haier, and then particularly into their fascinating work in Kentucky, turning around GE appliances, which they bought in 2016 and have opened up the human potential in a striking way. And so to kind of quickly summarize my experience at Haier, which is that I have kept knocking my head up against the radicalness of Mr. Zhang and his view of the primacy of human potential. And we've talked a lot about Rendenhai, and Rendenhai is their philosophy, which loosely translates to sort of maker and user co-value creation. But I kept trying to say, well, is this kind of entrepreneurship, like the thing they would study at Babson College? And said, well, yeah, but entrepreneurship is usually too controlling a concept. It's usually used to get your people to be entrepreneurial. He said, really, Rendenhai has an atmosphere. It's an atmosphere to support human creativity, and it's the human creativity that is the thing that drives it, and everything else is built around that. And so in these Haier, as I think many people know, has been split up into many micro enterprises, and some of them are tiny, some of them are a little bigger. GE Appliance in Kentucky, we're talking to the executives there, and they say they argue constantly about whether they have 14 or 17 micro enterprises, but it's somewhere around that. So those are pretty big. Those are like, sort of an oven micro enterprise, for example, or a stove micro enterprise. But there also are tiny little 7 and 8 person micro enterprises, which seem to be more the model in places that have been involved with this for a long time. And I find it strikingly similar to how Amazon Web Services, AWS, has grown to be the biggest cloud service in the world by breaking everything up into what Jeff Bezos calls 2 pizza teams. And then each team has open interfaces and open APIs to the work of other teams from their technology. And that gives them this enormously flexible, co-evolving kind of system. And Haier is doing that same thing in manufacturing, in making of appliances. But what's been striking to me is that I cannot find any of the residual examples that I look for in terms of forcing a hierarchy or a model or a vision on people. Instead, they have these leading goals, which are kind of visions and dreams of where we might go. And then this very deep philosophy. And so what I finally concluded is that Mr. Zhang and his team are in constant dialogue with thinkers Obviously, people like Stuart Craner and the people that Stuart works with, but also philosophers and economists and customers and I don't know, political leaders, and just a constant conversation trying to deepen their understanding of the human being. And then they're doing scaled action research, trying to figure out what kind of system do you create to manifest human potential and human creativity, to aggregate it, to let it co-evolve and find interesting combinations so you get combinatorial innovation, and then ultimately just continue to grow and grow and grow, with in some sense its biggest product being the expansion of human potential, And I think it's so apt that they bought GE appliances, because I don't know, most of you are not as old as I am, but GE used to be known for, we bring good things to life. And you can go back on YouTube and see these great videos of this fellow feeling that GE was created through its advertising and through its products in American society, especially after World War II and then up into the 60s. So finally, I have made the shift, and my shift is that I think we have done a real, we've understudied the human side of business ecosystems. And let me not look at it as a deficiency, but as an opportunity. Look, there's a lot of interesting research out there on communities of shared minds. There's all the kind of collective intelligence research. I think it's not quite right, but it's the right scale. There's a wonderful group in England that looks at what they call big minds, and they've been very much a part of the British government's programs in developing various kinds of industries and other capabilities in the UK. There's a group doing what they call integrative economics at the OECD, at the Organization of Large Western States, that is also studying how you if you do holistic economic development, it really is holistic human development. We have the work of Elizabeth Altman and her colleagues, and I think she's on the call today at UMass Lowell. Fantastic work on what they call workforce ecosystems, where they're looking at how companies now, since they're hiring from so much beyond their own boundaries, begins now to have incentive to invest in the general human development around them, and then in turn be able to feed off of that. And similarly, she's got an amazing case with the United Nations Development Program, where it's got 60 different innovation centers around the world where people are building ecosystems. And interestingly, it's not big teams building ecosystems. It's usually kind of canonically 3 roles. There's one person who is kind of out looking for resources locally to make whatever solution they're working on. There's another person who's kind of mobilizing people, and I think there's another person who's kind of somehow they're interfacing back with the UNDP, and maybe they're getting funding, but they're basically catalytic roles that. So you have the tiniest of organizations actually in 60 different places in the world, and I think it's roughly 60 different nations. So this is a movement. I'm also seeing really interesting academic work from the communications field. There's a field of sort of organizational communications, and they talk about how organizations are constituted from communication. And I can tell you the reference at some point, but there's some really great papers about the connection between the mindsets that are created and then what people do, and how that together is really the essence of the organization, and how it works and looks at the world and creates value. So with that, I've embarked in a sense, a new research career trying to understand the human ecosystem. My friends at Tsinghua are also really interested in that. Obviously, the higher people are the absolute reason that this has happened in my life, and I'm extremely grateful. So thank you very much. With that, I love to have some questions and get to know you as much as I can remotely, like this, virtually.
Thanks, Jim. That was brilliant. Please send in your questions, and I will relay them to Jim. I mean, what intrigues me, Jim, in the 1980s and 90s, when you were going into organizations and talking about ecosystems, what kind of reaction were you getting? I can see that somebody like Andy Grove, who was a really bright guy, might get it, but a lot of other people must have shrugged their shoulders and shown you the door, surely.
Yeah, well, it was, we were, to go back to the scene, right, particularly in the 80s, there were a lot of interesting things going on that were, broadly in this paradigm, like the quality movement and all that. So as long as I talked about things as, say, quality process improvement or concurrent engineering or things like that, that was fine. Cross-functional teams, all that worked. But when I come to ecosystems, it was funny. At first, we were pretty careful about how we talked about what we were doing, and because we were getting informed by it, and also ironically, most of our work back then was actually about people and organizations and human resources strategies and things. But I remember particularly when I wrote the Harvard Business Review article. Before they publish it, at the time at least, they let you have a kind of it's basically a typescript version of it that you can show to people and give to your friends. So I gave one to Bob Allen, who was the CEO at AT&T, or actually a friend of mine, Hal Burlingame, the head of human resources, gave it to Bob, and Bob gave it to the board. He liked it, but he put a note on the thing before he gave it to the board, and he said, he called me Jimmy because I was still pretty young and I'd been there for a while. He said, I think Jimmy's paper is really pretty good, but I want to say I just don't really buy this ecosystem thing. And that was kind of it. It wasn't macho enough, and I kind of liked that it wasn't macho enough, although I was a very competitive guy. But yeah, no, it looked silly to a lot of people.
Well, I always say that something like a science like management is universal and timeless. It took management to build the pyramids or 10 the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. It wasn't management as we might recognize it, but many of the same elements were there. And it strikes me the same with ecosystems, that ecosystems are universal and timeless. It's just the question of how far we understand them and how far we utilize them.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that was a question or an observation.
Well, okay. Well, I think that Ken Wilber, who's a sort of mystic intellectual who people have probably heard of. Ken Wilber was asked whether the Buddha's enlightenment would be better now than it was, back in the day under the Bodhi tree. And he answered that, of course it would be better because we know so much more. And so he'd be enlightened on top of everything else. And so I think that one of the things that's really fascinating is that there's all this stuff going on in complexity theory. There's all this stuff going on in these various sort of mathematical disciplines that bears on this. And then also we're just in an explosive time in human potential. I mean, I have two 20-year-old sons, and I'm on the phone, and they live in Cambridge, Mass, and they're on the phone the night, and they said, "Dad, do you know that Harvard just started a center to study psilocybin?" And psilocybin for mental health. I was like, "Whoa!" Yeah, I mean, it's a wild world out there in the human potential area.
Yeah, it certainly is. Elizabeth Voltman thanks you for the shout out earlier, and she says that she was similarly originally told not to focus on ecosystems if she wanted to be a real researcher because it was too much of an industry buzzword.
That's great. Thank you, Liz.
But when you talk to people now, sorry, carry on.
No, go ahead. That's fine. What's the next?
So who gets ecosystems when you talk to people, organizations, industries, cultures? Is I mean, I can see you've talked a lot of examples from the technology industries. Somehow, I think we can understand how they get it, because there's the culture of entrepreneurial companies, the culture of technology development kind of lends itself to an understanding of how ecosystems works, I think. But is it more difficult in other industries for them to comprehend the power?
I think it's become, so this may be my biased observation and people just saying nice things to me, but I think it's become very, very ubiquitous now. Part of it, in a funny sort of way, and I don't mean to undermine it, but there's a way in which the concept is so broad that it's really kind of just a point of view. And I'm not saying that people haven't, including me, tried to systematize it and learn more. But at root, the basic insight is I'm not alone, and my success doesn't depend on just the things I control, or just the things that a traditional firm was really built to control. And that if I want to make change, it depends on other people. And then sort of the next loop is, and if I want to make change, it would be helpful to go get to know the people who are making that change and see if we can come up with something together. So it's at some level, it's not a very, it's not a very tough concept.
Yeah, but in some ways, I mean, ecosystems means embracing complexity and ambiguity. So I visited at Haier in China on a number of occasions, and I'm always struck by the sheer complexity and level of vagueness and ambiguity. And I accept that something might be lost in translation, but I think they're comfortable with it, and they use it as a kind of dynamic force. But 20th century corporations in the West were built around simplicity and clarity.
Well, I agree with you. Actually, I take that. I really do take that. I think you're right. I think that if we really are talking about what Haier is doing and embracing complexity at that level, and you and I were talking privately, I guess last week, about how hard it is for all of us to trust other people and to open up to other people in the way that ecosystem wants you to do and rewards you for. So I do agree with that. I think that, actually, as you say that, I think, maybe people haven't gotten it at all. They talk about it a lot, but there's an awful lot of control going on. And there's an awful lot of still seeing, kind of the firm's function as control, whether it's agency theory or whether it's, the bundle of contracts idea. There's a recent book by a guy I love, talks about, the firm is a bundle of contracts to better control people. I think on that level, you're right. And I think maybe it's better said this way. The ecosystem thing can encompass pretty tough controlling approaches. And I think maybe we need an even deeper term for what Haier is doing and for this kind of human potential revolution. I would agree with it.
And there's an interesting juxtaposition, obviously, with the situation in China, but somebody from Hungary has sent in a comment saying, how can you create businesses based on values, vision, and aspiration for solving a problem in a semi-controlled, strongly centralized economy and society? So I think there's a juxtaposition here between, we're talking about ecosystems in corporations, but in many societies, Chinese society is very, very controlled society. Our attendee from Hungary lives in such a society. So it's an interesting juxtaposition.
That is just that's actually a very profound, question. And first of all, let me say that I think China is sort of much more, free and open than at least the kind of, general media view is in the U.S. at least. I found, there's an awful lot of creativity and freedom there, and I don't know about Hungary, but on the other hand, I want to say, yes, there's a tension between, I think it's the same thing, how much is a country able to develop its human resources, which I think China has been able to do very well, and then versus killing the goose on the golden egg by control, and particularly in real. Again, I don't know about the situation in a lot of other countries, but I think it's it's really tough. I think I think part of what you got to do probably is make little islands that you can carve off, and within those do what you can do.
So to summarize, what you've been saying is that the pandemic has opened your eyes in many ways to the human side of ecosystems. And there's an interesting question. What then are the human ecosystems you're now studying?
Well, I mean, first of all, higher still, and I feel like I'm just now. It's like Alice, going down the rabbit hole. I'm just now finally realizing how profound it is. And one of the things I want to do is spend more time when I can get vaccinated and go back, is go to Kentucky and spend time there, because I think that's a sort of a fascinating cross-cultural situation, and the potential seems to just be rising there in really wonderful ways. So it's that one. But let me jump to another one, which is, in a sense, the whole Earth. We have this problem, right? We have. I wrote something and decided not to use it in this talk, but I was thinking, I still think about the planet somehow has a kind of big mind, and has a kind of we have a kind of a shared experience. And one of the challenging things of our time is that there are a lot of people who want to spread misinformation in there, and in this kind of overall zeitgeist, or whatever you call it. I mean, it's the world that, Stuart, you live in with Thinkers 50. I mean, in a certain sense, what Thinkers 50 must do for you is gives you this kind of this excuse to think all the time about kind of what is the sort of shared collective complex vision happening in business. And so, yeah, I'm very interested in that, and I'm very interested in how we make that better for the world.
That's an interesting question from Antonio. To what extent is intellectual property protection a barrier or a concern for larger use of an ecosystem approach? So a company like Hire, how does it protect its IP when collaborating outside of the enterprise? I mean, that's a big issue, isn't it? Because companies traditionally have been very protective of their intellectual property for obvious reasons.
Yeah, it does, and I will say that I think if you want to really understand that or get into it, and I don't think there's a simple answer, but the answer, first of all, is intellectual property is really important, and people will not invest in and generate intellectual property if they can't get a return on it. But I will say there's a big difference between I generate intellectual property, I charge you to license it, but in general I freely license it to you, versus I develop the intellectual property and I either license it at very punitive levels, so it's unaffordable to most people, or I bundle it with a production system, and this would be the Intel approach, and then it gets me much higher margins in my chips. That's not a bad thing, but it's a thing that gives you so much power that you can squeeze your ecosystem sort of too far. Mark Leoncidi has written about this about Microsoft. That there's when you have so much power, and a lot of it is wrapped around not just individual intellectual property, but the thousands and thousands of patents that a big company has. It gives you almost too much power in relation to the people. But no, it's really important. In the ARM ecosystem, they do a lot of collective patent sharing. So they will build organizations. One of them is called Linero, where companies come together and they build open source sort of business software middleware, and they agree to cross license, and they agree on sort of a set of things as they go in. So that's the other way to do it. But I think it's a big issue. And anyway.
And what does all this mean for the job of the CEO? I mean, you talked about an orchestrator, and I mean, CEOs get promoted on their ability to communicate and certainty. and simplicity to some extent. Ecosystems are a bit beyond their traditional remit. So where does it leave CEOs?
Yeah. Boy, Stuart, you're going to some of the best questions. It's like obviously you are tapped into where business people really live and the dilemmas they face. I think that it's well. First of all, I think the role of the CEO is really, really difficult in today's world. There's so little they can control. They're under such a spotlight. I think it's a very, very difficult role. And Mr. Zhang and I see people like Andy Grove. People have a big advantage when they have been in a company a long time and their position is not at risk. And I think I don't know how you can do this stuff on a shorter term or with that kind of risk of being thrown out. Because yeah, you're right. Either your investors can throw you out, your current ones, or you can get a hedge fund comes and buys a bunch or activist fund and pushes you out. In the case of the Mr. Zongs and the Andy Groves and Bill Gates when he was in Microsoft and so forth, and a lot of others that aren't as famous, they have the time to be more of a philosopher and be this sort of action researcher. I mean, they have the time to experiment, and they have the connection to the organization where the organization will trust them and do it. And so I think, people like that I think are such treasures, in their system, because they can do these experiments that other people have real trouble doing. So yeah.
Well, it's interesting. You referred to the Intel treadmill, and you would say the same about Hire. For all the talk about ecosystems and the ambiguity I was talking about, there is still intense pressure to perform. It's still there. It's an interesting. Yeah. It is an interesting combination of the big picture and the nitty-gritty of actually performing.
Yeah. I think for me, the difference is whether people are performing under fear or like Olympic athletes or something. I think places like Hire and places like Intel, first of all, are they're places for people to be high performers. So they are really like Olympic training programs or something. I mean, I think they. Those firms are going to inevitably have a lot of pressure and a lot of action. I think the difference is, do people feel trapped there? Do they feel like they can compete at the highest level? I think they're not, in a sense, humanistic organizations in the traditional way we sometimes think about them. They're not soft, and I just think we have to decide that that's what they are. I mean, if you want to build organizations that can work with a broader range of people, that's also very important. I
think another thing you alluded to in your talk was about the kind of the optimal size of organizations and the kind of dynamics between. So Jeff Bezos talks about two pizza teams, and if you go to Dunbar's number of about 150 being the optimum amount in any group. And it seems to me we're still kind of battling between the big is good philosophy of the past and now we venerate on small entrepreneurial startups, but they tend to be subsumed into corporations when they're actually bought. There's still that battle, isn't there? We're not comfortable with somehow.
Yeah. Well, I think that these are all big questions. My thinking on that, in part, is that the nature of the production function, to go back to that side, has changed, and we're now in a very modular world. And even startups, when they're focused on their minimum viable product, in some sense, what they're building is a kind of a packaged module that they hope people will grab a hold of and stick into a lot of other things. And I think that modularity and that kind of combinatorial innovation, where people say, okay, I can quickly combine this, and this, and this, and make something for maybe just this customer or for a bunch. I think that is kind of the world we're in. And so the small teams are perfect for the, making those little modules and advancing them. I have had this challenge at Hire about how do they do the big Elon Musk things. And Mr. Song and I had a conversation about it the other day. And he said, well, I like Elon Musk a lot, but that's not what I'm interested in. And he's interested in small and medium-sized business, which, by the way, is a much bigger opportunity than Elon Musk's opportunities. But I do think that it's really interesting what Elon Musk does, where he stakes out going to Mars. He identifies big system areas that are essential, like, how do I get the rocket? How do I reuse the rocket? And if I have to reuse the rocket, then how do I land it safely when it comes back down? And how do I get the control software? So he's coming at things from this big chunks view, which I really admire too. But somehow to me, that's in tension with, it seems, this kind of small teams and they agglomerate and build up. But I'm actually still waiting for Hire to prove me wrong on that one, or I guess say that there's a way that people can kind of I don't know about that area there.
Well, Elon Musk is building big factories, in bigger factories than Henry Ford made. I mean, an interesting contrast to that would be a company like Arrival, which is in the kind of is developing electric vehicles, but is going down the micro manufacturing route.
Yeah,
and more collaborative. So Elon Musk is almost an outlier. Is an old-fashioned outlier. Yeah.
I mean, maybe there are two ways. Maybe there are two ways. I agree. I think that's a very good point.
Wasn't it simpler when there was only one way? or we believed there was only one way.
There might even be three ways.
So, are you optimistic, Jim?
Generally.
Yeah. Do you think we're heading in the right direction in the way we understand and create organizations?
I think there is an awfully lot of good. There's an awfully lot that's happening in our world that's heading in a good direction. And yeah, I'm fundamentally optimistic. That said, I'm also scared. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine in Israel the other day, and he said, I feel like the world is balanced on a precipice, and there's all this amazing good stuff happening, but there's also amazing bad stuff happening. And he said, I feel like I could wake up 20 years from now and we'd blown it all up, or it'll be just a wonderful place. I don't know. I do feel some of that sense.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I like the GE slogan when you broke into song earlier, which is bringing good things to life.
Yeah,
and that could almost be a definition of ecosystems.
Yeah, actually, that's great. Plus the double meaning of life. Yeah. Thank you. Boy.
Jim Moore, our time is up. We've really appreciated spending an hour with you, and your insights and ideas continue to enlighten and enliven the world of ecosystems. Anybody watching, thank you for everybody for watching. I recommend you check out Jim's books, still required reading. And look forward to you joining us on our future sessions. We've got a session in an hour with Christian Sarkar.
I can do that. Yeah.
Okay. Christian's a great thinker, bringing good things to life. That's a nice.
Yeah, I know. I'm excited about all of them today. Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
And thank you, everyone, Jim, and thank you everyone for joining us. Bye.
Okay. Bye.